because we have a lot to cover today. So good afternoon and welcome to CEPS. My name is Sophia Rosak and this is the first event of 4 that we're going to do on the EP elections here at CEPS. So the 9th European term is coming to an end. The members of the European Parliament met last week in Strasbourg for the last time, and slowly the campaigns are gearing up, and in early June people are going to vote. And as things look right now, the next European Parliament will be more right-wing. What does it mean? It means that more members of the European Parliament will sit to the right of the EPP. That includes the ECR group, European Conformists and Reformists. That includes the ID, Identity and Democracy group, but also those, or some of those, that do not belong to any of those groups, such as Fidesz. So, okay, but what are the effects? I mean, how united is the far right? What is their agenda? And how would it affect the EU's agenda? And how disruptive could this all be? I think this is a perfect moment to find some answers to those questions, and I'm very happy to have Doru Francesco here with us today. He is the founder and CEO of EU Matrix. Some of you will still know him from VoteWatch. And he brought an analysis for us where he looked deeper into voting behavior of MEPs on the far right. And then we'll have a stellar panel with us here today to discuss what he will present to us. We have Michiel Hogeveen, an MEP from the from the ECR. We were supposed to have one from the Renew. No, from the ECR, much more important because you can bring us some inside information. And then we have Rebecca Christie. She's a Europe columnist for Reuters Breaking News and very well-known commentator on EU politics. And lastly, we have Wouter Wolfs. He is a professor at KU Leuven and did extensive research on populist parties and Euroscepticism. Doro, do you want to kick us off?
All right, so thank you very much for the invitation. A pleasure to be here again after a lot of time. What we did at EU Matrix was to publish yesterday a report. For those of you who don't know, at EU Matrix, what we, among many other things that we do, is to look at every single vote that goes through the European Parliament and see what it is about and how the MEPs are voting. This is the basis of the report that we have published. We wanted to shed light into the actual positions of a lot of these parties, because as Sophia has said, many of them are set to gain more seats at the next European Parliament election. And the question on everybody's mind is, okay, so what? Will it make a difference? Where will it make a difference? Where do they actually stand? There's a lot of information circulating in the media that this party does that there are more radical, more extremists. We wanted to look at the actual votes, the actual data, and to see what this data may tell us. Of course, the data doesn't tell us everything, and this is what we have the panel for the discussion afterwards, but at least it's a very good starting point. So, as soon as it is possible to switch to the website, because also for those of us that are following us online, and I understand it's not possible to see directly the link to my website, you are also able to navigate. It's eumatrix.eu, and you can see the charts that I'm going to present here in this room. The way we do it is that we place the political parties in this chart, in this matrix, on depending on how they voted. The more they voted in one direction, in this case we're looking at the first case study is asylum and border control, as you would expect. This is a hot topic, especially for some of the parties to the right of the EPP. So the more they voted for a restrictive policy across the files in the European Parliament, the more they are to the right of this chart. The more they voted to the left, the more they would be to the left of this chart. Now, the vertical line here is the median point in the European Parliament. That is the average of everyone in the European Parliament. That's where the current point of compromise or point of equilibrium has been in this Parliament. So that this also gives us an indication about the distance between individual parties and the middle ground, the point of equilibrium. Now, we have placed in this chart the parties, the bigger parties that belong to the ECR, ID, and Fidesz, which is non-attached, but still to the right of that political spectrum. And what do we see? To give us a first insight. Well, we see that, especially on asylum and border control, That's where, unsurprisingly, that's one topic where they do agree, and there are very few differences between them. Almost all of them push for a restrictive as possible policy when it comes to this. So you would say, yes, but we expected that. Okay, but then let's see some other policy areas and see if there are differences. Now, this is LGBT. This is a point of equilibrium here, which is very, very to the left. Let's call it on libertarianism. Now, of course, the labeling and the definitions can be subject for debate, but the important thing is to get a general understanding of the differences. And then we put to the right conservatism. Now, you see most of them being to the right on the conservative side of things, but some of them, like the N-VA, the Belgian N-VA, or the Swedish, they are more moderate, or at least this is how they voted in this current term of the European Parliament. Now, let's take some foreign policy topics to see where they stand. Obviously, a very hot topic, Israel-Palestine. This is where the EU is quite split on the matter. Everyone to the right of the EPP here is on the side of Israel. Yeah, let's put it simplistically in this way, whereas the average point in the parliament is somewhere in the middle. The EU's policy on the Asia-Pacific, we put it generically as closer to China and allies versus closer to United States and allies. Now, most of the parties are closer to the US and allies. Brothers of Italy, which is probably one of the biggest delegations that we have in the next European Parliament, is quite radical on this matter. So is Law and Justice from Poland, Vox, Italian Lega, and VEA, and the Swedish. They're very aligned to the policy of the United States. On the other hand, Fidesz is somewhat more moderate, whereas Alternative for Germany and then Rassemblement National are the furthest away from that point. So they have rather different views on the matter. Relations with Russia. And relations with Russia, we put them on the axis of being assertive or supporting Ukraine, if you want. To the right of this is supporting Ukraine. To the left of this chart is less support for Ukraine. To have Alternative for Germany is being the least supportive of Ukraine, Rassemblement National, Marine Le Pen, then Fidesz. And then the other ones are on the very other side of the debate. Brothers of Italy, Law and Justice, Vox being strongly supportive of Ukraine. Relations with NATO in general, you see similarities here. Rassemblement National being the most anti-NATO, Alternative for Germany somewhere in the middle. The rest, however, being quite supportive of a strong NATO. And what about the European defense? No, the defense agenda will be high on the agenda for the next political cycle in the next commission. Common European defense to the right of this chart. Most of the MEPs do support strengthening defense union. None of these parties do. None of these parties. There are variations, with the Alternative for Germany being the most opposed, quite radical on the matter, not wanting to hear anything about such thing as European defense. The other are somewhat more moderate, but in general, they don't think it's a good idea. EU enlargement. Most of the MEPs are supportive of EU enlargement. None of these parties are, with variations. Again, Alternative for Germany and Marine Le Pen's Rassemblement National are the most critical of EU enlargement. The most somewhat supportive are Polish Law and Justice and Brothers of Italy. Buy European Act, a sort of protectionistic measure. Here, the most supportive of a geographic approach, if you like, for the EU institutions to introduce quotas of products being produced within the EU. Rassemblement National, again, Marine Le Pen, Brothers of Italy here. Now, here, this is something that they agree, Rassemblement National and Brothers of Italy, on introducing geographical criteria for public procurement. Banking union, risk mutualization to the left of this chart. Only Fidesz would be somewhat supportive, interestingly enough, whereas Alternative for Germany is at the other end of the scale. Support for artificial intelligence, another topic which will be quite interesting in the next political cycle. Now, most of these parties are on the market approach here. So they are not that keen on regulating it. And GDPR also, they're more on the, let's call it market approach versus regulatory approach. It also chose something from agriculture. Pesticides has also been a big topic for those in the agri-food sector. Most of these parties are for a market approach, so no ban on pesticides. Some of them are more moderate. NVA and Rassemblement National have had mixed views on the matter. 3 more areas: greening of the agriculture. None of them is so keen on greening of the agriculture. NVA is somewhere in the middle, Rassemblement is somewhere in the middle. All of the other ones are against. Nature protection and restoration, another hot topic decided upon in this European Parliament. Only NVA, the Belgians, were voting for it. So focusing on the environment, whereas the other ones are on the market side of things. And natural gas, last example, all of them are on the side of more incentive for natural gas and no restrictions. Now, if you want more of these examples, you can find them on our website, or you can contact us. After having shown their positions, then the question is, okay, so will any of these make a difference? How successful were they in this European Parliament? We looked at their amendments to the plenary stage of each of the political groups. That's what this chart is measuring. In other words, Renew group, so the political family of Macron, has been the most successful in this term to push their amendments through the European Parliament's plenary. 71% of their amendments made it into the actual reports or laws. So even if they were the third in this parliament, they managed to leave their footprint quite a lot on the European legislation, more so than the socialists and more so than the EPP. You see, so just being the biggest doesn't mean that you are the most successful, because you don't have a majority, and this will bring us to the discussion on the potential coalitions in the next parliament. Interestingly, ID, the ID group, if you're wondering how successful they were, 0.23%. That means through the whole term, they have drafted about several hundred amendments. They have managed to sneak in only 5 of them. Yeah. ECR, on the other hand, 17% is doing somewhat better. Yeah. The question is, how will they do in the next term? Well, this picture may change, because of the changing sizes. But it's one thing to push through your own amendments. It's another thing for your votes to be needed by the other political groups to push theirs. And that's where the key debate will be in the next parliament, on how EPP will play the game to make coalitions more to the right or more to the center. In this parliament, those who have won the votes, again, Renew was at the top, Socialists followed, and EPP was only third, despite being the biggest again. Whereas ID and ECR were here, 41 and 54 respectively. So still, ECR was on the winning side half of the time. But it very much depends from one topic to the other. As you may know, the coalitions in the European Parliament, they're not something stable. They're something that change from one vote to another. You can have a centrist coalition now, and 30 seconds later, you can have a center-left or a center-right majority. And just to give you an example, because this makes the point, when they voted on the green transition, most of the files in the Green Deal, the Renew has won more votes than the EPP. The Socialists have won more votes than the EPP. Even the Greens and the left have won more votes than the EPP when deciding on the Green Deal. So what does that mean? It means that the current parliament was pretty tilted to the left. The leftist group have had the advantage, even though they were smaller, but their coalition was quite big, and they managed to put the EPP in minority on quite a few matters. And I think this will be the main change in the next political cycle, because the EPP will not grow, but the parties to the right of the EPP will grow and will give it options for coalitions. And the options look like this. Now, the centrist EPP, S&D, Renew coalition, wherever they agree, they will still have, according to the current polls, we're 1 month away from the elections, but according to the current polls, they will still have something like 57, 58 8% of the votes. But when they do not agree, when EPP and the Socialists compete with each other, we'll see center-left versus right on regulatory matters, regulation of the internal market in general, that's where we see a left-to-right split, then it is everybody's game. No matter how you put together the combination of parties, you're very close to 50% or only just. Renew would need, or the left would also need Renew in order to be competitive. So Socialists, Greens, the left, and Renew are about 50% of the seats. EPP and everything that's to the right of EPP are also close to 50% of the seats. What does this mean? It means that things will become more unpredictable, and we will have to, or even more unpredictable than in this parliament, and those in the middle will make the difference, because this is just a rather superficial analysis, the first layer of analysis. In reality, the groups are not cohesive. This is just on paper, like coalitions, EPP, Renew, because in reality, the MEPs deviate a lot from the group's position, from the position of the rapporteur, much more so than in the national parliament. So more accurate analysis would have to take into account the position of each MEP. And before I end and sit down with you, just to say that, to make a little bit of promotion to the little website that we have launched, it's called Euro MP Match. If you haven't decided yet who to vote for in the European elections, this is a quiz. It takes you through 20 matters that have been voted in this parliament. So we entered into the system 20 votes from across the areas, foreign policy, environment, agriculture, you name it. So you vote on this, you choose yourself which of them are more important to you, and at the end you will see your MEP of choice, your best match, and let's see if you agree with the result or not. Thank you very much.
Perfect stage setter. Thanks a lot for this, Doro. And I'm just going to pass on immediately, Michiel. So we've seen it in terms of success when it comes to amendments. There's quite a difference between the ECR and the ID. From your perspective, where would you draw the line? What is the demarcation between the two groups?
Well, first of all, thanks. Is it on? Hello? So first of all, thanks for inviting me here. I told my supporters that we are now in recess for campaigning, and they asked me, why are you in Brussels? Well, I shared obviously the link that this is live streamed to YouTube, and I think that, and I came here because I do believe this is a very important subject during this campaign. Indeed, we're seeing in the polls now that there would be a supposed majority of right-wing parties, but it's very important to make it clear where the differences lie, and and to show that it's important that when people vote on a party that comes into European Parliament, that they know how to influence the legislative process. Because you can sit there and you can vote, but as long as you're not participating in the legislative process in the European Parliament, you will not change law, you will not change anything. So it's very important for people to understand when you vote for a certain party, you also vote on politicians that are actually delivering. Now, when coming to your question on the difference between the ECR and ID, many times we're put in the same box, far right, extreme right, but there are some vast differences between the groups. First, on what actually, where we stand together, where we stand side by side, well, obviously that's tackling illegal migration and tackling the ever-expanding bureaucracy of the European Union. So that's where we more or less align. But there are other areas where we vastly differ. That's mostly on the economy. ECR is much more prone to free market economics, free trade agreements, sensible regulation, less regulation for our businesses, small, medium-sized businesses, so really the focus on the economy. And the second part is that, and we saw that very clearly in the research done, that we are much more of an Atlanticist group. So we're very much pro-Israel, pro-Ukraine, pro-NATO, pro-forming a Western alliance in order to counter the rise of authoritarianism amongst other parts in the world. So those are really the areas where we vastly differ. And there are some other differences, but I think those are the main points.
Do you identify as far right?
well, it defines on what you mean by far right. I saw the graph on migration, for example. Well, the line, which was the medial line of the European Parliament, it was far left. So in that sense, well, I don't consider myself far right. I consider myself as a common sense politician that tries to come up with concrete solutions, but also tries to deliver.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Wouter, coming to you. We see in the practical political process, we see a quite strict cordon sanitaire towards the ID, right? But we see a lot of cooperation with the ECR. This is also what the numbers have shown us. So there is inside the parliament a very strict differentiation between these two groups when it comes to their treatment. If you now look at the parties that are the constituent parties of these two groups, do you think that's appropriate? I mean, do you think that everything that's in the ECR is moderate and fine and everything that's in the ID is bad?
No, and that's what also I think the data of Doro shows. If you look at what is the distinction between the two groups, then it's not exclusively ideology. Because if that would be the case, then on all these different questions, you would have a nice line from top to bottom, all blue dots, and a bit more to the left or to the right, a nice line top to bottom, all black dots. That is ideological coherence. That's what you would expect. But what you saw is a mixed pattern, mixed dots. Some parties on some aspects are closer to parties from other groups, and some are closer to the others. So it's not really ideology. An important aspect, I think, is this idea a bit of respectability and national reputation, that for some parties, it is important not to be associated with other parties in the European Parliament. This has been the case, for example, with UKIP, and the reason why UKIP was never in the same group as Marine Le Pen, for example, the Front National, Rassemblement National. The same for the Scandinavian parties. They don't want to be in the same group as Marine Le Pen. It's interesting that now the reverse is happening, and Marine Le Pen is distancing herself from the Alternative für Deutschland 3 times now in the last 3 months. That's an interesting evolution. So yeah, I think that's not necessarily appropriate. Maybe the last element that I maybe want to add is this: I think there is a legacy of the UK Conservatives. So the ECR was a group that was founded by the UK Conservatives, who came from the EPP basically, and who gathered around themselves a group of what they call respectable allies for this more small government, big market kind of approach. They're gone now, but I think to some extent this legacy is still alive in the European Parliament, especially in the EPP, for example.
Yeah, and I would like to ask a little bit later what Brexit did to your group. But first, Rebecca, what do you think? Where does the distinction lie between the two groups?
The big challenge dealing with any of these surveys is that they all work with the coalitions that we have today. And we don't know what alliances will form after the election. A thing that blew my mind recently is that the Italian Five Star Party could choose to align with the Green in the next parliament. And if they do that, then the Greens suddenly are in contention for third place. They certainly keep their number of seats they have now. I mean, every pre-election story you read in the mainstream media these days, including my own outlet, Reuters Breaking Views, says maybe the socialists and the EPP are going to stay the same, but whatever, the Greens are going to go down, and this means the whole parliament is going to move to the right. Well, not if the Greens stay the same, not if people realign. On any given issue, it's hard to say what is going to capture voters' attention, where the alliances are going to be, and also how they want to be in relation to each other. I think that's very important. If Meloni and Le Pen end up on the same side, whatever side that is, they will have a nucleus of votes and will probably attract people to them. And that could really upend these alliances right now, because these days, what you hear people saying is, oh, we don't expect to see a super right party. We don't expect to see the right forming a parliamentary majority. That's probably true. But you could have 3 groups. You could have the French and the Italians moving to the middle, and then people on either side. We see that as parties become more in the running to actually govern, they change their stances dramatically. Meloni now is governing at the international and EU level like a centrist. She's saving her most sort of historically right-wing policies for her domestic audience. Le Pen may or may not be sort of working along the same lines. N-VA in Belgium was in the government, now is out of the government. AfD in Germany was the flavor of the month, now is the flavor not of the month. That may just because people are bored. That may not even have to do with their tilting right and left. So that's sort of where we are.
Yeah, speaking of three parties, we had three far-right groups up until 5 years ago, right? There was the Europe of Freedom and Direct Democracy, or what were they called? What bizarre name, yeah. Do you think there's any chance that the ID and the ECR merge? Same question to you afterwards.
No. No. As you said before, we had even 3 groups to the right of the EPP. I think it's much more likely that we'll have more than 2 than fewer than 2. Yeah, that will be. I think, as the members of the ECR also say, the differences there are so big. Also in terms of policies, let alone the fact that they don't want to be associated with each other as leaders because of national considerations. But the differences in policies are quite big on many matters. As I said, starting from foreign policy with regulatory matters, with ECR being substantially much more pro-market than ID, which is much more protectionistic. The differences are huge. So I would be really surprised if they formed a group. I think, and there are some of the leaders announcing that there will be new groups, somewhere in between, or even to the left. We saw an announcement now that the far left might split into 2. So, no.
Michiel, I would be surprised if you say something else now.
Well, I think that it would be the same if you would ask the question on whether on the left group would merge with the Greens. I think there is obviously some alignment, as I explained earlier, on migration, on tackling the expanding bureaucracy of the European Union. But indeed, as was mentioned, there are vast differences in many policy areas. And also, and that's I think one of the most important aspects, is that the ECR group is much more on delivering politically. We saw that in the numbers. We saw that we are much more on the winning side when it comes to amendments, when it comes to legislation, but also when it comes to rapporteurships. We actually take on the work. And I think that's a very important distinction.
So how about Orban? Is there any chance that Orban joins the ECR?
I don't know. At this very moment, we're seeing, I think there are 13 MEPs from Fidesz, and they are now politically homeless. I have come to know these MEPs. They come from the EPP. They are very hard-working politicians. So in terms of legislative work, I think they could be an asset. But there are some vast differences between what I believe and what my party, Ja21, stands for and what Fidesz stands for, especially when it comes to Ukraine. Especially when looking at how to deal with rule of law issues, when it comes to freedom of the media. So I don't see it happening anytime soon, but we don't know. We don't know how this will develop.
And would there be any delegations within the ECR that would be in favor?
I don't know. I cannot speak for any other delegations on that respect.
Okay. I have many more questions, but I just want to tell you guys that you are, of course, also welcome to step in. So, if you have a question in mind, I will open the floor a little bit later. Rebecca, what effect would it have on the agenda of the EU? I mean, if we have more, some polls say up to 30% of so-called far-right MEPs. What do you think? What will be the effects on the policy agenda?
It really depends on how these coalitions form. It really depends on national politics. I think the reason we saw Fidesz the most supportive of the banking union is that Fidesz is the one of these parties that is really in control of a country where financial stability matters. Hungary is not part of the euro, but it cares a lot about whether the EU is taken seriously by the rest of the world. So national priorities will determine what happens next from here out.
And what will the EPP do? Everybody expects that they will be tempted to find partners more to the right. Do you think that's a scenario?
I guess I want to push back against this idea that it's one continuum. For one thing, we see sort of if you have left and right, you also have a top and bottom pro-Russia and anti-Russia. And this is a completely different set of alliances than what we have. For me, as an economist, admittedly we're a very small part of voters, I am pro-immigration, anti-subsidy, pro-EU debt, and pro-trade. There's no party that's for that. So how do we line all that up?
A new party. Doro, what's your take on the future EU's Commission's and EU's agenda for the next term if the elections will prove, the projections prove true?
That's a good point. The elections are not the end of it. The elections are just the beginning of very complicated 6 months of discussions, negotiations, hearings, and everything. And I think the mere fact that there is a possibility that the President of the European Commission will be voted not in July, as it used to be the case in the previous cycles, but in September this time, and this is what the Parliament seems to want, already tells us that we'll see some changes in the sense that the Parliament wants to be more important, it wants to show its muscles, it wants to avoid being seen as a rubber stamping institution, and this time they may even succeed. They may succeed precisely because von der Leyen or whomever comes out of the Council at the end of June will find it quite difficult to put together a majority in the Parliament. You saw the numbers. Already some parties within the EPP, if it is von der Leyen, they have said no, we're not going to support the French and the Slovenians in the Renew as well. So the negotiations will be quite difficult. Now, we can already expect some of the priorities to be there. As I said, the defense union will be one of them, security, cyber security. The green agenda will still be there for those that I'm sure there are plenty of you who care about it. There is, and some of them will say that the Green Deal is dead. The Green Deal is not dead. Probably it will slow down, but that's one of the consequences. Others will still go ahead. No, we'll still have a commission, a parliament, and by the way, the European institutions, more or less bureaucratic as they are, depending on who you ask, but currently they are, in a way, the most stable on the continent because all across the continent, the governments are changing faster and faster. If you look, and we did this analysis, you find it on our website, it is very rare nowadays that a government stays for the whole duration of their term. 4 or 5 years, depending on the consider. The European Parliament and the Commission are almost the only ones who stay. So think about that.
Rebecca.
So we talk a lot about how the percentage of so-called right-wing parties in the parliament has increased over time. It's also worth thinking about how, as the treaties have changed and evolved, the percentage of policy files in which the parliament position is really relevant has risen over time. And this really changes what the parliament does because you have a growing number of parliamentarians who can really affect the policy agenda, not just make a statement, not just try and test the waters, but really affect the technical file. And this also upends our idea. We see Michiel working on the digital euro file, which is a very mainstream file that involves the big banks. It's not an extremist file at all. We see Johan van Overtveld from N-VA working on joint debt and the EU budget, even though the right supposedly is against federalizing finances and all of these graphs. So as individual folks join the parliament and want to achieve change in line with their personal or national or party objectives, wanting to be relevant will push them as much as their left-right axis.
Yeah, maybe building on this, I think that's an important issue that we shouldn't forget is, of course, that for each of the votes in the European Parliament, a new coalition needs to be built, which means that there's not really a fixed government and a fixed opposition, although in practice it's sort of the case. But it also means that there are possibilities for the EPP, for example, to work on some aspects with ECR and ID and part of Renew, for example, if you think about migration, if you think about the Green Deal and environment. And it depends on two issues, I think. One, the EPP willing to keep their options open. And a lot will depend on what will happen just after the elections, whether or not they will engage in a coalition agreement with the S&D and Renew, possibly also the Greens. Will they do it, yes or no? And the second element are the other groups, ECR and ID, willing to play ball, willing to engage in actual policy making. And we might see it sooner than we expect, because there is also a chance that we will see radical right candidate commissioners that will be appearing in front of the European Parliament. What will the EPP do in that case? Will they have an open mind? Will they strike deals behind closed doors and make a deal? We don't criticize your candidate if you don't criticize ours, as has been the case in the past. So that will be already a very interesting test to see what might happen in the rest of the legislative term.
I mean, we have elections in Austria coming up, where the far right is polling first, right? So we might have, for the first time, a European Council member. I mean, council member we already have from the Lega. For the first time, a European Council member from the ID group, and by extension, a commissioner, right?
The Netherlands, don't forget the Netherlands.
The Netherlands still, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, the situation is still unclear there, right?
It's still very much unclear, but I would like to comment on what you just mentioned on that, on the right, that they need to start play ball. And I think that's a very good comment, because I've been working as a rapporteur on legislative files, and I had to work together with political groups across the aisle. But there was always one group absent, and that was the ID group, especially when I needed them to get my point through during the long and tough shadow meetings. They were just not there. And I think that's really, if you look at a new composition of the parliament, when it's supposedly becoming more right-wing, is it willing and able to deliver on policy? And I think that, for example, we now look at the polls in the Netherlands, where we see the party of Geert Wilders, the Freedom Party. It's on the top of the charts in almost all the polls, in every poll. But if you look at the numbers, they've been sitting in the European Parliament for over 15 years now. And what did they deliver? There was a journalist who looked through the numbers. Zero legislations were passed by this party. We have Geert Wilders in the Netherlands who says, well, I want to become prime minister. What has he delivered? He's a very effective opposition leader, and he's a very talented, I think one of the most talented political leaders in the Netherlands. But what has he delivered on policy? Zero. So we have someone saying, I want to become prime minister, but you have not shown any experience in passing actual legislation. And I think that's a big problem.
So no true parliamentary work outside of the ID.
Yeah, and it also, if you talk to the voters are looking for change. They want to tackle illegal migration. They want to tackle the stringent regulation on their businesses. So they want parties that can actually deliver. And that's the real question when it comes to the upcoming elections. Can these parties live up to their promises?
Wouter, why do so many people vote for far-right parties?
It's a simple question with a very difficult answer. It really depends very much on the situation. A couple of elements. In some cases, it's really about the substance. Some people really care about migration and think it's important and have a bit of a positive vote in a way, a vote of support. There are also people for which is more of a protest vote, that they're really fed up with what the government is doing, for example. There are more and more indications as well that it links to a more general feeling of abandonedness, that in rural areas where a lot of services are disappearing, shops are disappearing, banks are disappearing, people feel abandoned and find for some way a voice in the radical right. And maybe a last element, in terms of campaigning, my impression is that the radical right parties are often more aggressive and also more effective communicators than a lot of other political parties, and also makes a difference, especially on social media.
Wouter has touched upon Brexit, and I would be interested indeed. So the Tories left the EPP in 2009, I think, right? Something around then, and founded the ECR. Now, since 2020, they're out, and the biggest group is the Polish Peace Party. So what changed in terms of atmosphere inside the group?
Well, as a Dutchman, I was very sad to see the Brits leave. I think as a center-right party from the Netherlands, we were very much aligned in terms of policy, in terms of legislation, in terms of political communication with our friends across the channel. So we were very sad to have them leave. I do believe that the ECR has committed to its, well, we have the Prague Declaration, which really has some which really outlines what the ECR stands for. I think that has more or less stayed. But obviously, if you see delegations becoming bigger from different parts of Europe, so from either Eastern Europe or Southern Europe, obviously some things will change. So yeah, the way the party or the group is communicating, obviously it has changed.
And in terms of voting behavior, Doro, Can you identify a difference?
Well, in the ECR, they were voting according to their national interest anyway. It's not like the British could have driven the others to vote against their national interest. So I wouldn't say there is a dramatic shift. Of course, the British Conservatives were much more, or their main topic of attack was free market, deregulation. Yeah, it wasn't migration. They weren't talking about migration. So that was giving the ECR group a different label, if you like, which is focusing more on the market. Whereas after they left, they have started to be seen more as associated with migration. In the case of law and justice in Poland, with the issues of the rule of law. So indeed, the brand has changed, but the voting behavior on many matters hasn't.
I would like to, no, first of all, maybe let me have a look. Is anybody here that wants to pose a question now? Otherwise, I'm not going to run out of questions, but I would like to give you the chance, please.
Thank you very much, Janet Utsei from the Cons. I wanted to put in the discussion the issue of whether that might change a lot, that the political parties are in favor of peace vis-à-vis war. So this contrast, because in Central and Eastern Europe, this is not a big issue, whether there are really political parties which say that we want peace, and people really prefer to have peace. I mean, nobody wants war, yeah? Normally, this is a normal voting behavior that everybody wants peace, especially seeing now the tremendous casualties, several 100,000 casualties. So what is this? Is there any impact of this contrast which will be in the focus of many political groups, political parties? ECR, I just wanted to mention there are. And the second question is, you did not mention one party, political party in your group, namely the Czech, which is in government, yeah, Pet Fiala party. That I wanted to know your views about how that impacts on the future potential results of the European Parliament elections as far as your political group is concerned, that party is very much now moving towards the mainstream parties as we see it in the current European Parliament, so not really in the main focus as you just described, what the political priorities of your group is.
I'll give you a moment to respond, but Rebecca, want to step in on the peace and war question?
Peace and war are so hard to define in a political context. And rather than single out a European government, I will pick on my own home country. I grew up, as you might be able to tell, in the United States before I moved to Belgium and became a European voter. And the peace plan of one of the candidates for US president is, let's just give Ukraine to Putin, then they'll stop fighting, right? Is he the pro-peace guy or not? I think there are people who would have dramatically different views on that. So I would shy away from using these simple terms. Yes, it would be nice if everybody lived together peacefully, but that is not the situation. And if your only goal is to stop the shooting as quickly as possible, then you probably don't make the best choices in terms of democracy, long-term interests, even long-term shooting at other people. Those are hard decisions.
But I mean, this narrative is motivating even new parties to arise, right? I mean, this is in Germany. This is the key motivation for the new party from Sarah Wagenknecht, Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, right? Michiel, would you like to respond to the Czech question?
Yeah, well, first on the peace versus war, indeed, it varies on how you define peace. I think it was Ronald Reagan who said peace through strength. So don't appease, don't give in to dictators, and try to counterbalance in that sense. So I would like to reiterate the words of my colleague panelists that it's very difficult to define this in the political debate. On the Czech party, well, obviously, if you are in government and you take responsibility, your policies and your political style will change. Otherwise, it's especially when you're in a coalition government. I cannot speak for my Czech colleagues. They've been operating on by themselves, and indeed, as was mentioned, in the ECR we have a ground rule. We have a voting list, we have a sort of guideline on how the ECR would like to have you vote. But if it's not in according to your national interest, you're free to vote differently, and that really differs in the ECR group when comparing it to, for example, EPP or Renew, where you more or less have to align to the line of the group. We are much more freely to choose our own path in terms of voting.
Yeah, that's exactly what Wouter also told me once, that you also observe from an academic point of view. Is there anybody that wants to step in now or a little bit later? Yes, please, the gentleman. Oh, no, yeah, okay, yeah.
Thank you. Sebastian Schaffer, Volkswagen Group. I have learned and I respect, and it's obvious that there are policy differences between the ECR group and the ID group. However, the future development won't only depend on policy, it will also depend on what leadership or what the central leaders of both party groups really want. And so my simple question is, what do Giorgia Meloni and Marine Le Pen really want? What is in their defined interest? And if they decided to form an alliance, would they be able to force it through in their respective party group?
Who dares to speculate? Who knows what's on the ladies' minds? Doro.
Since I'm not a member of the parties, I have more freedom to say. Well, I think there's a big difference there between Meloni and Marine Le Pen, because Meloni, as we have seen over the past few months, has been much more interested to be seen as part of the game, as part of the system, as part of the political forces who will instate the next president of the Commission and the college as a whole, also because she will have a commissioner, whereas Marine Le Pen will not. So, and I think if you look at the numbers, again, between us, the many of us here, the votes of Brothers of Italy are going to be crucial for a second term of Ursula von der Leyen as a president of the Commission. There's no way around it. If you look at everything, you put together the numbers, that big delegations, which will probably have 20-something, maybe 27 seats, is very important. Therefore, there's a big difference, and that is also the reason that prevents Meloni from associating herself too much with Marine Le Pen, because Marine Le Pen is much more in an opposition game, both at national level but also at European level. There's no reason for Marine Le Pen to come to the center and be seen as part of the system. She has a very different narrative, whereas Meloni has an interest. She needs to show to the Italian electorate that she is capable of protecting their interest in Italy, and she can only do that as being seen as an ally of the system. But of course, in order to be seen as a winner, she needs to get a strong commissioner or a strong role in the next system. So either a strong commissioner or some Italian at the presidency of one of the institutions.
Rebecca.
Meloni and Le Pen would seem to have the most in common with some of their domestic and social policies, and they would seem to be rather far apart on economic interests, which of course is where they can have more impact at the EU level. Le Pen is very much in favor of European champions, as I understand, of bolstering EU industry, of protectionist policies, whereas Meloni is much more interested in trade and engaging with the world. It's hard for me to see them just deciding that they want to be on a team now and all of those considerations go away.
Let's talk one moment about social media, because the far right is able to capitalize on that like nobody else, and it becomes increasingly important. I'm going to tie you in, absolutely, have you on my radar. And I find it quite interesting because we see, traditionally we said that the younger the voter, the more left, right? And now we see things shifting a bit. There was a study, we talked about this in the German, by a German newspaper, which found out that Germans between 14 and 29, while their support for all the traditional parties goes down, it's going steeply up for the AfD, the far-right party in Germany. And I think that has everything to do with social media. Would you agree, Rebecca?
No.
Tell me.
It's really tempting to say the youth are organizing these days in ways that are completely different from before, and this is changing how they respond. I don't think that's the case. I think it's more that youthful frustration and disaffection with the shortcomings of their elders is pivoting around to a different set of priorities, and it's looking differently. I would say social media is a problem because of the increasing potential for disinformation, for impersonation, for those things. I think that's up and down the age spectrum. If anything, older voters are maybe less media literate and more likely to fall for something that is a fake but that they don't realize online.
Wouter, you did a bit of research on social media. Can you tell us a few words?
So yeah, we've been looking into, for example, expenditure patterns across Europe and political parties and how much they spend on social media. We're still doing the analyses, but there is a trend that indeed radical right parties on average spend more on social media than other parties. In other parties, it depends a bit and it differs from country to country, but if there's one trend, then it's that far-right parties spend more and are more active on social media. I think it's also, to some extent, it's because they're that kind of party, right? As a party, you can invest your resources in many different issues. In policy, you can do research, yeah? Or you can invest everything in communication. And radical right parties have done the latter in most cases. They're really focused very much on communication. And as already mentioned, they're very effective communicators, and social media is a good platform for their type of communication. If you've seen the debate yesterday of the lead candidates, for example. Looking at the viewer numbers, at least one or two of you watched yesterday. And what is interesting in the final speech of Anders Vistesen from the ID group, the ECR was absent yesterday, which is a bit unfortunate, I think. But it was black and white. It was war and peace. It was a yes or no. So it's very, very dichotomous communicating. And that really, that fits well with social media and the speed that you have. And that is something that a lot of other parties, and especially the parties in the center, are struggling with.
Is it also because they're neglected sometimes by classical media?
Yes, I mean that is one of the typical hypotheses that radical parties invest in social media because they are ignored by mainstream media. It very much depends on national context, because there are countries, I know some research on Belgium, for example, that indeed parties from the government are more in the news. But when you talk about panel shows, the difference between opposition and even the radical right opposition and the other parties is not that big. So for some countries, I think it makes sense, but it really depends on the national context.
Are you campaigning on TikTok?
I think my party is, but I'm not personally on TikTok for that. No, but I think that your last question was very important, and that is indeed that getting appearances in the classical media is very important in order to gain traction, in order to attract voters. And well, for example, in my country, the Netherlands, it's very difficult to get on these classical media appearances. And if we look at the more centrist, mainstream, older parties, for example, the Christian Democrats in the Netherlands, they were decimated. They only have a handful of seats left in the parliament. But they have a subscription with all the major talk show channels. They are constantly invited on television to explain about policy, to explain about politics, to explain about how they would like to see the world better. But they've been in power for a very long time. They've been decimated, and many parties are now much bigger than the Christian Democrats, but they're much less invited. So we see that parties, but not only on the right, I should say, but also on the left, have adapted to having the mainstream parties, having the domain of classical media, and they've been much more focused and have been much more learned to be much more effective on social media.
The Christian Democrats should actually do better then, no? If they have so much appearance on TV, visibility.
Well, that is what they say, that the biggest potential of the Christian Democrat parties lies on the graveyard. So it's not necessarily, it doesn't really have a path for growth in that respect. And that also has to do with they don't appeal to voters in terms of policy, but they also have no way of communicating towards younger audiences via social media.
Yeah. It's also an issue of representation, right? Young people don't feel represented usually by certain parties.
And I would like to add one more thing, and that is obviously also very important, that is the algorithms on social media. I notice it as a politician myself. If I put a post out on that I've been a rapporteur on European long-term investment funds, well, I don't know, maybe 2 likes. But when I post a video where I say things about how von der Leyen has been a president of the Commission, and I go in as a hardliner, well, then you have a higher chance of going viral. So it also encourages certain behavior.
Yeah, and some far-right politicians, they exploit that by hardly conveying any political messages anymore, right? I mean, John Badella and so on, I mean, they're master to tweet about or to send out messages on all kinds of platforms on everything but politics.
Yes, and they go from one trend to another. So you have the farmers' protests, they put on some boots, they have the phone, they make a video, and then they go back to Paris. So that's really a new style of a politician. Yeah. And well, it depends on whether, are we actually ever going back to the old policy style debates, or is this really the new?
Or is the genie out of the bottle? Rebecca.
Legacy media, the traditional media, the mainstream media, which are the words that we tend to hear in English, although I love classical media and I may start using it. This is, the establishment media has a reputation for fact-checking, for accuracy, and for reputability. And it's important for everyone at every other place in the media sphere to have that anchoring center, particularly to have wire reporters, to have places where you start out getting facts, and more facts. And so you need people who are going to talk about facts. If you're a mainstream media reporter or even commentator, you need someone who's going to talk to you about the fact at the center of it and not an idea. You can't have a Wilders type politician if he doesn't have a center to push against. So when you're wondering why do certain politicians become overrepresented, it's because you have to look at who's willing to be the center, and that serves a public role, I would say. I would also say that particularly in the Netherlands, you know, the most quoted Dutch politician for years was Jeroen Dijsselbloem, who is ostensibly a socialist, whose party had no seats, and he was the face of European austerity. Just not a traditional socialist position. So it's hard to...
But it's a traditional Dutch.
It is. But just to say, you know, if you're sitting here counting party groups, who's in the media? Well, you had this socialist who had no seats in the media, who yet was representing a very strong majority-held opinion from his country and from across the Euro area.
I would like to tie in your question.
Thank you. Gillian Sater from Burson, Conan Wolf Public Affairs Firm. Thank you. My question was around this, actually. So, but just to say, yeah, so we did our own study, which showed that MEPs at the extremes of the political spectrum receive more traction on social media and digital media, and centrist MEPs have more impact on policy making. So indeed, you know, the disparity we're talking about, we're aware of that here in Brussels, and I wanted to ask about how we, you know, bridge this gap between this echo chamber and citizens who need to understand, you know, which MEPs and politicians are delivering policy outcomes for them. We've covered some of those topics, but maybe a bit more at EU level. What is, you know, the role of the media, or maybe the role of the Parliament? As you know, Michael MEP, you mentioned, you know, some posts get some traction, but if you talk about dry legislative activity, it's not as interesting, let's say. So, any thoughts or reflections on what the EU institutions might need to do, or the role of the media in helping bridge that gap?
Thanks for that question. Who would like to answer?
Yeah, well, about the behavior of the MEPs is just in the parliament is just as in the public sphere, in the sense that if you get access to power, then of course you're going to get busy with making reports, drafting amendments, if you know that yours are going to be adopted. If you know that you don't have access there, you have to do something. You're not just going to stay in the parliament doing nothing. So therefore, you rely on other means of making yourself known through speeches, through parliamentary questions, and through the social media. So you see how the two are you have a cause and effect here. The same with their behavior in social media and the traditional media. If you don't have access there, you have to go somewhere else, and you go to the social media. But other than that, yes, I think we all have a responsibility here. I don't think it's the responsibility of the public institutions, be them national or European, to tackle this through yet another layer of regulation. I think it's the responsibility of the political parties, of the media, and every other influencer and communicator to, you know, to keep things, to not make things tabloidic or tabloidish, yeah, and to keep a certain level, a certain standard of communication when we're talking about what's happening in Brussels. and speaking about information and disinformation, and there is I think this disinformation has become now a very circulated word, but we're not going to fight disinformation talking about disinformation. We're going to fight disinformation if we're providing to the citizens quality information about what is going on here, about how decisions are made, accepting the fact, accepting the pluralism of opinion, because this is one of the things that I have noticed over the past few years. I think we're seeing a bit of an increasing intolerance to different views. Yeah, that's what we're seeing, and we have to remind ourselves that we're functional democracy where tolerance of the other people's views is a fundamental principle to consolidate our democracy. Just because we have different views, it doesn't mean that or the voters are voting for different parties. It doesn't mean they do so because they have less information or they have a different intellect. It may simply mean that they have more information or that they have different interests. Yeah, so I think this is how we need to communicate to the public, to remind ourselves who we are in terms of a democratic society, and encourage a high-level standard in the quality of information and pluralism.
Yeah, maybe I do think, though, that the EU institutions have a responsibility here, and I think that they are trying to take that responsibility now. I think that it's a good thing that they're directing their efforts towards the platforms, basically, and the modalities of the platform. So we had the Digital Services Act, we had regulation on transparency and targeting of political campaigning, and these kind of efforts are important. Why? To establish a climate also on social media in which you avoid echo chambers, because that is important for democracy, right? You have two important conditions: is that you have an exchange of views, and that you're confronted with also positions and arguments that you don't necessarily agree with, but that can make you think. And secondly, that this is all based on accurate and true information and not misinformation. And I think there is a huge responsibility for the social media platforms, and that has been the regulatory effort of the EU institutions, and I think it's a good thing. There is also a responsibility for the parties, obviously, because I don't really like social media campaigning. It's always a very short video snapshot of 20 seconds about an answer to a minister, and then the response of the minister is not shown. It's not very deliberative. It doesn't really add that much to public debate. But then again, yeah, political campaigning to some extent has always been like this, but how can we keep it within certain boundaries and limits? That's the most important issue.
Who else would like to step in? Mesha, in the last row.
Thanks very much. Melchior Szczepanik, Polish Institute of International Affairs. Two very quick questions. I have a feeling, I observed European elections for a number of times, and I have a feeling that always when the election comes, we are considering various changes in the balance of power, changes between different flows between political groups, different alliances, and then not much happens in terms of change. So I wanted to ask the panelists if you were to name the most likely change when it comes to alliances, new parties joining different political groups, which one this would be? And the second quick question to Doru, whether you noticed some change in the voting behavior of Fratelli d'Italia following the creation of Meloni government, whether you noticed some high-profile changes.
Do you, Doru?
Yeah, that's a quick one. Yes, but even then, when they started being in government, we were saying already then that they are not that far as some people would say, whereas the information presented in some of the media was saying, because, or okay, they could have been there in the national political arena. That's a different discussion. But here in the European Parliament, their behavior was already, flirting with the EPP and with the center on some areas. And again, that's why I showed it depends very much on the area. When it comes to foreign policy, it's one thing. When it comes to protectionism, it's another. But they were already back then potential allies of the EPP.
So, Wouter, what kind of change do you expect?
Yeah, it's hard to speculate, but I maybe want to take the opportunity to talk about a different issue than the radical right, to highlight it a bit, and it was already mentioned, the Five-Star Movement and Sarah Wagenknecht, because there was a short news article last week in which she claimed that she had sufficient support for her own parliamentary group in the European Parliament, 23 MEPs from 7 member states. I wonder if that is the case. I'm a bit skeptical, but who knows? But that could cause a realignment on the radical left side or on the left side, where you have a very Eurosceptic radical left and a more pro-European radical left. And for her, for Sarah Wagenknecht, I think the Five-Star Movement would not necessarily be a bad ally. I think in some aspects they would fit together nicely. And if you have these two parties, and you can indeed gather some more and have a more EU critical radical left positioning, and then have the European left now moving or having more pro-European MEPs, that could be an interesting realignment as well. That's not only on the right, it could also be on the left. But we'll see. That's one speculation that I want to throw out there.
Yeah, I mean, it seems that right-wing populism has overtaken left-wing populism a little bit lately, no?
To some extent, yes, in the sense that, I mean, the financial economic crisis was a different story, obviously, when it was a lot about economic issues. And that was, I think, the ideal climate for radical left parties to surge, which they also did in some countries. But yeah, times have changed, and we had the refugee crisis. Now it's also more about foreign policy, about energy, agriculture. So it's a different atmosphere. But indeed, there are some parties like Sarah Wagenknecht who are coming up, and it's not only about radical right, but also new radical left parties coming up and positioning themselves and trying to find a niche in which they can prosper in the political landscape.
Who else would like to step in? Yes, third row on the right.
Yeah, Enno Ebersbach from the regional representation of Baden-Württemberg. I just had one question that goes maybe a little bit in retrospective. I was just interested how the internal discussion in the ECR was on the judicial reforms of the Law and Justice Party in Poland, and in general maybe on the whole topic of domestic reforms of the judicial system of member parties of this political group.
Thanks for the question. Michiel.
Well, that's, again, when we talk about the ECR, we first and foremost see each other as partners that are aligned in order to have legislation passed through. When it comes to domestic policies, we usually don't have very large discussion on, for example, the situation in Poland or in Italy or in the Netherlands. We try to stay focused on really the European issues that we have agreed to work together on. Obviously, in the Netherlands, there has been news items that have been put on me or other parties within the ECR. So there indeed has been some discussion, but the current the PIS party is no longer in the current government, so it's no longer really any talking point in the ECR right now.
There's at least one more thing that we should touch upon, which is foreign interference. And I mean, the latest scandal just broke last week, right? When the staffer of Maximilian Krah was arrested for allegedly spying for China. So, you know, the more these scandals come up, especially to the right side of the political spectrum, the question is, are far-right parties more prone to espionage and bribery?
If you look at the cases to some extent, yes. I mean, we have had a lot of cases in the last couple of years where there was some kind of foreign interference. I mean, I look at mostly from my angle that I'm studying, that's political finance. And you had indeed a lot of cases in which there was financing of political parties, for example, contacts, but it's not exclusively the radical right. I think it's more prevalent if you look at all the cases. It's an interesting study that we should do to simply look at all the cases that are present, but that would be my impression, yes. But it's not limited to the radical right, obviously. But yeah, it also depends on the national context. For example, okay, Marine Le Pen, she got a loan from a Russian bank. And her argument was, okay, but I couldn't find any sponsorship anywhere else. Okay, that's fine, but maybe it creates certain dependencies which could be problematic, and that is something that we should talk about. So I think there is, at this point, from what I can see, a higher risk indeed for radical right parties for foreign interference, at least through some financial channels and financial support.
Rebecca.
Any new political actor is going to be more vulnerable to just control failures than people who are part of the establishment and know how to vet staff. So to the extent that all of these people are new and maybe don't have a base of staffers, of alumni, of people to feed in, they're going to be at risk of hiring. All foreign interference is also not the same. Taking Russian money above or under the table is very different from having Chinese infiltration, because Russia and China have such very different interests in what they're trying to get. And the same thing goes for other players. People come in, you know, one can imagine people who are more active in espionage worldwide than others, and one can also imagine a single issue that drives each of those nation states' opinions in terms of where they place their people and what information they're trying to get, let alone what influence they're trying to have.
So what do the Chinese want from us? What did they want from the staffer of Maximilian Krah?
You know, without any knowledge of the people involved, zero. And without any knowledge of whether these people actually did it, because I understand that this is just a theory and we don't actually know anything. But one could imagine a situation where in Germany, a place where you have a very divided coalition government and you have an official government policy of being partner, competitor, and systemic rival all at the same time, one might want more information about what's going on the inside, and one might want to be inside the room. And what better way to do that than to become the chief of staff of somebody who might be new to the process and maybe needs some help? That would be, even if you weren't trying to influence the outcome, that would be a very good way to gain information.
Right. Michiel?
Well, I read the story on this assistant, and I was just completely baffled when I read it. I mean, in the past, these things used to be more prone to the left. You would have the so-called fellow travelers who would travel to North Vietnam or to the Soviet Union, and they would come back and would say, well, things are not that bad over there. But apparently that is now also happening to parties on the right. I should mention, however, if I heard your question correctly, it's more prone to happen to the right. Well, we had the biggest political scandal 1.5 years ago in the European Parliament, and that was right within the S&D group and the Green group. So to only talk about right-wing parties being involved in scandals, I would think that's a bit of an understatement.
Yeah. Okay. Do you want to step in on this?
I think everything has been said already, at least about these stories.
All right. Well, then I'd say we have only 2 minutes left. So we're at the end of the session, but I would like to give each of you 30 seconds, but really not more. What is your main takeaway of this session? And I would like to relate back to its title. Are we crying wolf? Are we crying wolf? Or is there a serious issue that we're heading towards? Rebecca?
We need more facts. We have a lot of conjecture. We don't have a lot of facts. And that goes for the coalitions, the party groups, the voters, and all of those things. So I guess I would say to all of you, support your local wire service and get those facts out there and hold off on the commentary to the extent possible.
Michiel?
People want change, and people have been voting for change when looking at and voting for mainstream parties. But these parties have not delivered, and now the people are angry. And the people are thinking of, how can I throw the biggest imaginary Molotov cocktail to my capital or to Brussels in order to really make that change? And I think one of the most important takeaways is that we also need to go to voters, really listen to the voters, listen on how they want change, where they want change, but also that we need to go to voters and explain on how we are going to deliver it concretely in terms of legislative work. I think that's very important for political parties, for politicians to convey to voters.
Wouter?
Yeah, I think that we didn't really talk about like substance, but what we need to think about are what is the reason that some parties don't work with radical right parties, and there are some red lines that you don't want to cross. So that is that we need to have attention for what is acceptable and what is not within a democratic society and a democratic debate, what are our democratic red lines, and that we really approach and discuss this also with people that do not engage with this, or that do not really follow up on this, and that cross these red lines. And that is something very important that we need to keep in mind, I think.
Doro, you have the final words.
Well, just to say that, we're at the start of the electoral campaign, where in some countries it has started already, in others will start a bit later, like in France, for example. But I think we're lucky that, we live in a democratic society, we have pluralism, and we also have transparency of the European institutions that allows us to see the facts that we need in order to have this debate on a very informed basis. So I encourage everyone, for the remaining of the time between now and the elections to get the facts and to make yourself informed choices. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks to all of you for coming to CEPS today and speaking to us. It was very, very interesting. And thanks to you for coming and for engaging with us. And just to say that the next EP elections event that we will have in this very room is on 20th of May. And there we will have the former Secretary General of the European Parliament, Klaus Welle. We have MEP Sophie Infeld, and we will have Politicos Eddie Wax here. Goodbye. Have a good afternoon.